I gave them everything, my patience, my effort, my love, and they repaid me with indifference. They laughed when they took my home, dismissed my struggles, and told me I didn't need what they handed to someone else without hesitation. And now, after years of silence, they expect me to save them. No apology, no regret, just demands. The betrayal burns, but the worst part. They don't even see what they did wrong. And they never will. Growing up, I learned quickly that some people are born to be the center of attention while others are just background noise. My brother, Oliver, was the former, the golden child, the prodigy, the one who could do no wrong. And me? I was Beatrix, the afterthought. If Oliver got an A on a test, my parents threw a family dinner to celebrate. When I graduated with honors, they barely looked up from their phones. I told myself it didn't matter. I worked hard, kept my head down, and carved out my own victories, even if no one was watching. But deep down, I did watch. I watched Oliver get showered with love and opportunities while I had to fight for every scrap of recognition. I watched them give him a brand new car while I was handed the keys to an old beater barely holding itself together. I swallowed the disappointment, convinced myself that one day things would be different, that eventually, my parents would see me too. But that day never came. And the moment I realized just how little I meant to them, I stopped waiting for it. Because the truth is, some families don't love equally. Some just pick favorites. It happened on a day like any other. I was at my parents' house, sipping on stale coffee while my mother chattered on about Oliver's latest, big break. Apparently, his job had promoted him, again. I forced a polite smile, the kind I had perfected over the years, while internally bracing myself for the usual comparisons. But that wasn't why I was there. My dad had asked me to help organize some documents for them, a task they conveniently assigned to me whenever they couldn't be bothered to figure things out themselves. That's when I saw it, an unassuming envelope marked estate plan and last will and testament. I wasn't trying to snoop, but my name caught my eye. Or rather, the lack of it. My stomach twisted as I scanned the document, my fingers gripping the pages so tightly they crumpled at the edges. Everything, was going to Oliver. The house, the savings, even the family heirlooms. There was no mention of me. Not a single line. I felt the room tilt, my ears ringing as I tried to process what I was seeing. Surely this was a mistake. An oversight. A cruel joke. I turned to my father, holding up the paper as my voice wavered. What is this? His face paled for a moment before he let out an exasperated sigh, as if I were being dramatic over something trivial. It's complicated, Beatrix. Complicated. Complicated? I had spent my entire life trying to prove I was just as worthy as Oliver, and yet here it was, in black and white, a confirmation that I had never even been considered. My mother gave me that same condescending, pitying smile she always used when dismissing my feelings. Honey, you're independent. You don't need the inheritance. I felt something inside me crack. All these years, I had convinced myself that deep down, they still cared, that maybe I was just imagining the favoritism. But this was proof. Proof that I was nothing more than an afterthought in my own family. And they didn't even have the decency to pretend otherwise. I left that house in a daze, my fingers still clenched around the crumpled will as if squeezing it tight enough might somehow change the words written on the page. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, pressing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe. The entire drive home, my mind replayed the conversation, dissecting every excuse, every dismissive shrug, every time they had told me I didn't need it. What did they mean, I didn't need it? I had worked for everything I had. Scraped by. Built a life with nothing but my own determination. Meanwhile, Oliver had everything handed to him, his education paid for, his first car a brand new luxury sedan while I got a 10-year-old clunker that stalled every other week. When he needed a down payment for his house, my parents had written the check without hesitation. When I had struggled through student loan debt, working 2 jobs to afford rent, they told me I'd be fine. And now, they had decided, without so much as a conversation, that I wasn't worthy of a single thing from them. Not the house I had grown up in, not even a sentimental trinket from my childhood. Every last piece of my family's history was being handed to Oliver, as if I had never even been a part of it. I slammed my car door shut and stormed into my apartment, my mind a tangled mess of emotions. I told myself I wouldn't cry, I refused to cry over this. But the moment I threw the will onto my kitchen counter, my vision blurred. Not because of the money, or the house, but because of what it meant. It meant I had never really belonged. That no matter how much effort I put in, no matter how many times I showed up, proved myself, worked harder than anyone else in that family, it would never be enough. I thought about calling them, demanding an explanation, but what would be the point? They had already made their decision. And now, it was time for me to make mine. The rage didn't hit all at once, it crept in, slow and insidious, like a fire spreading beneath the floorboards. At first, it was just disbelief, a sickening numbness that made my limbs feel too heavy, my thoughts too scattered. But as the days passed, that numbness twisted into something else, anger. A deep, burning, relentless anger that refused to be ignored. I replayed the conversation over and over in my head. My mother's sweet, patronizing voice saying, "Oliver needs it more than you do." My father, nodding along, not even bothering to make eye contact as if I were just some pesky obligation they had to deal with before moving on to their real child. And Oliver, his smug little smirk, the way he had leaned back in his chair as if he knew this was how it was always going to be. Like I should have expected it. Expected it? Expected to be treated like I was nothing. Every time I thought about it, my blood boiled hotter. I had been the good child. The reliable one. The one who never asked for much, never made a fuss. I had worked my ass off, paid my way through college, built a stable life without ever once needing a bailout from them. And somehow, that made me less deserving. I paced my apartment, my mind racing. The injustice of it all sat like a weight in my chest, making it hard to breathe. They had used me, no, discarded me, as if all my years of effort, all the sacrifices I had made, meant nothing. I had spent my entire life trying to prove myself to a family that had already decided I was never going to be their priority. And now, after all these years, I finally saw the truth. I clenched my fists, feeling my nails dig into my palms. I had wasted too much time, too much energy trying to earn a place in a family that had never truly seen me. Well, no more. They had made their choice. Now, it was time for them to see what it felt like to be left behind. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, like the calm before a storm. My phone remained silent, no messages, no calls, no half-hearted attempts at smoothing things over. Not that I expected any. My parents had already made their stance clear, I wasn't important enough to fight for. And Oliver? He was too busy reveling in his latest victory to care that I had walked away from it all. At first, I thought the silence would be a relief, but instead, it only fueled the bitterness growing inside me. I spent my nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why. Why was it so easy for them to cast me aside? Had they ever actually loved me, or had I just been tolerated, an afterthought in the grand plan of their perfect family? The realization that I had spent my entire life fighting for crumbs of their affection left a hollow ache in my chest. But if they thought I was just going to disappear, they were wrong. Instead of wallowing, I let my rage drive me. I worked harder, threw myself into my career with renewed determination. Every ounce of energy that had once been wasted seeking my parents' approval was now focused on something real, something that couldn't be taken away from me. I picked up extra projects, started making strategic career moves, and little by little, I carved out a future that was entirely my own. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the exhaustion felt unbearable, when the resentment threatened to choke me. But I pushed through. Because if my own family had taught me anything, it was that I couldn't count on anyone but myself. Then, months later, as if the universe was testing me, the first message came through. My mother's name flashing across my screen like a ghost from a past I had tried to leave behind. "Beatrix, we need to talk." I stared at it, my fingers hovering over the screen. Oh, now they wanted to talk. I exhaled slowly, letting the anger settle into something colder. Something sharper. "Fine. Let's talk. But this time, it would be on my terms." I took my time before responding to my mother's message. Let her sit with the silence for a while, let her feel what it was like to reach out and be ignored. It was a taste of what I had endured for years, begging for scraps of their attention only to be dismissed as unimportant. But now, the power had shifted, and I wasn't about to hand it back so easily. When I finally responded, it was simple. "What do you need?" The reply came fast, almost too fast. "We need help. It's about the house." I felt a cruel satisfaction bloom in my chest. The same house they had stolen from me, handed over to Oliver like a prize, was suddenly a problem they couldn't handle. Of course. Curiosity got the better of me, and against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them. I didn't know what I expected, maybe some groveling, a desperate plea for assistance, but when I walked into the cafe where we had arranged to meet, I found my parents looking not regretful, but expectant. As if they still held the upper hand. My father sighed dramatically, as if this whole situation was just so difficult for him. "Beatrix, you've done well for yourself," he began, his voice laced with forced warmth. "We always knew you would." I bit back a bitter laugh. The audacity. "We've hit a bit of a rough patch," my mother added, giving me that same condescending smile she always had when she was about to manipulate me. "Oliver and his family, well, things didn't work out as we planned. He's struggling, and we're in a bit of a bind with the mortgage." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "And?" My father cleared his throat. "We need financial help. Just a loan to keep things steady." I let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of their words. Then, slowly, I smiled. "Ask Oliver." The color drained from my mother's face. My father's jaw clenched. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one begging. And damn, it felt good. I watched as my mother's face twisted in barely concealed frustration, her usual facade of warmth slipping at the edges. My father cleared his throat, shifting in his seat as if he were trying to keep his composure. Oliver should have been their safety net, their golden child, the one they could always rely on, except now, he wasn't. And that realization was hitting them harder than they were willing to admit. My mother was the first to crack. "Beatrix," she said, smoothing out the napkin in front of her as if she could iron out the awkwardness of this conversation. "Oliver has had setbacks." I almost laughed. Setbacks? That was a generous way of saying he had squandered every opportunity they handed him while I had been left to fend for myself. "So have I," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "I didn't have a house handed to me. I didn't have my parents covering my bills. And yet, somehow, I managed to figure it out." My father's jaw tightened. "It's different for him," he muttered, as if that was supposed to mean something. I leaned forward, folding my hands under my chin. "Oh, I know. It's always different for him." They both looked at me then, my mother with forced patience, my father with growing irritation. They had come here expecting me to fold, to be the good daughter who sacrificed herself for the family that had never done the same for her. But I wasn't that girl anymore. "If you're struggling," I continued, "you have options. Sell the house. Ask Oliver to step up. Maybe it's time he learned how to take responsibility." A thick silence settled between us. I could see the truth in their expressions. They had already asked Oliver, and he had refused. Their perfect son, their golden child, had left them in the cold. And now, they were scrambling for the backup plan they had spent years ignoring. It was almost poetic. I picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, and savored the moment. They had built this mess. And I wasn't going to clean it up for them. I could feel it in the air, the tension thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. My parents sat across from me, their expressions frozen somewhere between desperation and disbelief. They had come here expecting me to cave, to do what I'd always done, sacrifice, compromise, bend until I broke. But this time, I wasn't breaking. "I don't understand," my mother finally said, her voice softer now, laced with forced patience. "We're family, Beatrix. Family takes care of each other." I let out a slow breath, watching them carefully. Funny. That wasn't the rule when I needed help. My father exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "That's not fair." I laughed, low and cold. "No. Because it seems pretty damn fair to me." I leaned forward, leveling my gaze with his. "You gave Oliver everything. The house, the money, the unconditional support. And I was left to fend for myself. Now, when things have finally caught up to you, you want me to fix it?" My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled back before she could touch me. "Beatrix, sweetheart, please. We're in a difficult spot. We don't have anywhere else to go." My pulse pounded in my ears. For a moment, I let the silence stretch between us. Let them feel it. The uncertainty, the helplessness, the same crushing weight I had felt when they tossed me aside. It was justice, served cold and merciless, exactly the way they had once served it to me. I tilted my head. "You know what's interesting?" I mused. "When I was struggling, you told me I'd figure it out. You didn't offer me a place to stay, didn't care if I had to scrape by to survive. You told me to be responsible." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "So now, I'm giving you the same advice. Figure it out." My father's face darkened. My mother's eyes filled with tears. But I felt nothing, no guilt, no second guessing. Just the sharp clarity of justice settling into place. For once, they were the ones left in the cold. And I was finally free. As I drove away from that meeting, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My parents' stunned faces were burned into my memory, the silence that followed my final words lingering like an echo in my mind. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, I felt something else, something deeper, colder. It wasn't regret, not even close. It was the realization that this was the moment I had been waiting for my entire life. The moment I no longer needed their approval, their validation, or even their existence in my world. For years, I had been the outsider, the afterthought, the one who was expected to endure, to sacrifice, to make do with less while Oliver reaped every benefit. They had laughed when they told me the house was his, smiled as they dismissed my struggles, turned away when I needed them the most. And now? Now they were the ones who had nowhere to turn. I reached my apartment, stepping inside and shutting the door behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. My phone buzzed, a text from Oliver. I stared at the screen, debating whether I even cared to see what excuse he had now. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Wow, Beatrix. Cold. I didn't expect you to be this petty." "Petty. Petty." I let out a bitter laugh. Of course, he didn't see it. He had never once looked past his own privileges to realize what it had cost me. To him, I was the selfish one. Not the parents who had abandoned their own child in favor of another. Not the brother who had taken everything without a second thought. No, it was me, for finally standing up for myself. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked his number. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting to be seen. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come. I had finally severed the last tie binding me to them. And I had never felt lighter. As I stepped into my apartment that evening, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The weight I had carried for years, the desperate need for my family's approval, the ache of being overlooked, the exhaustion of constantly proving my worth, was gone. I had cut the final thread, and instead of feeling empty, I felt free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trapped in their expectations. I wasn't bending over backward to earn love that was never freely given. I wasn't their backup plan, their safety net, their afterthought. I was my own person. And that was something they could never take from me. I walked over to the window, looking out at the city skyline. This life, my life, was built without them. Every promotion, every struggle, every late night I spent working toward a future they never believed in, had led me here. And unlike them, I had earned everything I had. My phone sat on the counter, still flooded with missed calls and unread messages from my parents, from Oliver, from extended family members who suddenly had opinions about what I owed them. I stared at it for a moment, then picked it up, only to delete every message, block every number, and turn the phone off completely. I no longer cared what they thought. Their voices, once so loud in my head, were nothing more than background noise now. Instead of anger, I felt something new, something powerful. Relief. Control. Liberation. I grabbed a bottle of wine, poured myself a glass, and sat on my couch, stretching my legs out with a deep sigh. For years, I had thought cutting them off would feel like a loss, like severing a part of myself. But now, it felt like I had gained something invaluable. Peace. They had spent my entire life making sure I knew I was second best. But I had won. I had built something they could never touch. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need them. I was free. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. No dread, no resentment, no lingering weight of unspoken words hanging over me. Just clarity. Just peace. I made my coffee in silence, savoring the simplicity of the moment. No frantic texts from my mother demanding a response, no guilt-laced calls from my father trying to rope me back in. They had exhausted every trick in their book, and I had finally stopped playing the role they had assigned me. But I knew it wasn't over. People like them, people who spent their whole lives controlling others, didn't just accept defeat. They plotted, they schemed, they twisted reality until it bent in their favor. And sure enough, by the time I checked my email, there it was. A long-winded message from my mother. She didn't apologize, of course, she didn't. Instead, she played the victim, spinning a new version of the truth. We don't understand why you're doing this to us. We raised you. We gave you everything we could. We just wanted to be part of your life, and now you've shut us out. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around my coffee mug. Everything we could. They had given me scraps while handing Oliver the world. They had dismissed my pain, belittled my struggles, and expected me to be grateful for their indifference. And now that they had nothing left to take from me, they wanted to rewrite the past. Not this time. I didn't respond. I wouldn't engage. They wanted a reaction, any reaction, to prove that they still had some hold over me. But I had nothing left to give them. Instead, I closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and went about my day. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval, their love, or their regret. I didn't need closure from people who had never truly seen me. I was done explaining myself. Done seeking their validation. And that, I realized, was the greatest power I had ever claimed. The moment I truly felt free wasn't when I blocked their numbers. It wasn't even when I ignored their last desperate attempts to guilt me back into their web. No, it was much simpler than that. It was when I woke up one morning and realized they weren't the first thing on my mind anymore. For years, every thought, every decision, every move I made had been shaped by them, whether it was trying to earn their approval, trying to prove myself despite their dismissal, or trying to hold on to some scrap of hope that they would change. But now, as I stood in my own home, sipping my coffee, staring out the window at a world that finally felt like mine, I realized something. I had won. Not in the way they would define it. Not with money, or status, or proving them wrong in some dramatic showdown. No, I had won because I had reclaimed my life. Because their voices no longer echoed in my head. Because for the first time in my life, my happiness was my own. They had spent years making me feel like I was nothing without their approval. But now, I saw the truth. I had never needed them. They had needed me. And now, they had nothing left to take. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air, letting it fill my lungs with something that had always felt just out of reach: peace. Real, undeniable peace. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need them to understand. I had moved on. And as I walked forward, I knew, without a doubt, that I was never looking back.